Video we're going to learn about inflation, what it means, what causes inflation, and what the costs are that inflation brings to an economy and to the wider society. So we're going to start thinking about this by watching a short video that explains what inflation really is.
So you go to the store in New York and you buy a nice chair for $100. You go back next year and the same chair is for $110. Prices went up. And if there's a sustained increase in the overall prices of goods and services, that's inflation. In this case, 10%. And if you're making the same salary next year, but most prices go up, you'll feel poorer. And that's not a good thing. Did you know that some countries have experienced outrageous levels of inflation, which is called hyperinflation? In 2008 in Zimbabwe, for example, the inflation rate was 11.2 million%. So back then, you may have found a lot of use for this 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollar bill. In fact, Germany, Peru, and other countries have also experienced hyperinflation in the past. Deflation, on the other hand, is prices going down. And that isn't a good thing either. Let's say prices are going down by 10%. So for that same $100 chair, it'll only cost you $90 next year. So knowing that that chair will be cheaper next year, people will hold back spending their money now. This leads to less demand for chairs, less production of chairs, and businesses needing fewer jobs making the chairs. So that's why countries try to pick a target of low and stable inflation, which is good for the entire economy, and good for me too, because now I can afford a really nice chair.
So, inflation then, the official definition, and we've got a long one here and a short one, but inflation is a quantitative measure. In other words, something we measure with numbers. It's a quantitative measure of the rate at which the average price level of a basket of selected goods and services in an economy increases over a period of time. Now notice that we said it's a measure of the average price level of a basket of selected goods and services. And that's simply because it's not possible for governments to measure the price of every single good and service every single month or every single quarter. So governments tend to choose a selection of the most frequently bought goods and services. They call that a basket of goods and services. So governments will measure that each month, each quarter, and so they get an idea of how prices are rising across the economy. And we usually express this as a percentage. So inflation then indicates not only a rise in prices, but also, as we saw in a video, a decrease in the purchasing power of our currency. If prices go up, the quantity of goods and services that we can buy with our currency will go down. So perhaps a more simple definition is that inflation refers to a rise in the average level of prices sustained over time and a fall in the internal or the domestic value of our money. So what causes inflation then? Well, essentially there are two causes. One is all about demand. We call that demand pull inflation. And the other cause of inflation is all about supply, and we call that cost push. So let's start by having a look at demand pull inflation. So demand pull inflation is caused really by a general rise of aggregate demand. In other words, in the economy, more and more is being demanded. More people are chasing the same number of goods and therefore prices are forced up. So this could be a rise in consumer spending. That's the C in our aggregate demand formula. So if we're all spending more, then we're all going to be chasing the same goods and that will force prices up. On the other hand, it could be caused by a rise in government spending, the G in our aggregate demand formula. It could be that governments are spending a lot for some reason. Perhaps they're building new hospitals, new roads, new schools, and that means that there's more and more people, including government, chasing the same goods, and so prices will go up. Equally, that increase in demand could be caused by business investment spending, or it could be caused by a rise in exports, or possibly a fall in imports. So if we're buying fewer imports, we're probably going to be buying more homegrown or domestic goods. All of these changes will lead to an increase in aggregate demand, and that will lead to an increase in price. So let's have a look and see exactly how that happens. If we look at our aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram, we see that where demand and supply cross, we get our equilibrium. So we have national output at Q1 and the price level is currently at P1. So let's say that maybe consumer spending increases and perhaps investment spending increases as well. It could be any of those components of aggregate demand increasing. That will cause the whole aggregate demand curve to shift to the right because more is being demanded at every price. And the impact of that shift in the right of the demand curve is that now national output has increases, as you would expect, from Q1 to Q2, but also because the equilibrium has changed, the price level increases from P1 to P2, and that is inflation. That's our demand pull inflation, that increase in prices from P1 to P2 caused by an increase in demand. So this tends to happen along with the business cycle. As demand increases, and we can see our green aggregate demand or GDP line increases over time until it reaches its peak, at that peak point, inflation is likely to be at its highest because that's the point where demand is greatest and lots of people are trying to buy the same goods, and this forces prices up. But as demand slows down again with the economic cycle, we find not that prices fall, that's not right, but inflation will tend to slow down. And that's a really important distinction because if inflation was 3% at the peak, as demand slows, inflation is likely to fall maybe to 2%, then 1%. But prices are not falling, they're just rising more slowly. That's the important thing to remember about inflation. So that's demand pull inflation. What about cost push inflation? What causes that? Well, I said that cost push inflation is all about supply, and it is. And it could be any one of these things that causes cost push inflation. So we're going to take these one at a time. The first thing on the list there is supply shock. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, a shock to the supply could mean all sorts of things that's happening in the economy that really cause supply to either drop or perhaps stop entirely. So, for example, if we get a crisis in a particular part of the world or even worldwide, as in the case of a pandemic, for example, during a pandemic, supply has fallen tremendously because factories are shut, borders are closed, and that has caused a great fall in supply. It could be something like a war or terrorism that again stops firms from producing. It could be a sudden rise in the price of natural resources such as gas or oil used by most businesses and therefore causing an increase in the cost of production. It could be a natural disaster like a hurricane or a flood or forest fires or something like that. All of these things causing a slowdown or a stop in production, particularly of agricultural goods. Or it could just be a rise in prices of things like food. All of these things represent shocks to supply because all of them cause an increase in the cost of production. So if there's a supply shock, a hurricane or a war, and less is being supplied, what will happen there is that the price of raw materials or the price of energy used in production will increase. And we know that if the cost of production increase, then profit will fall and businesses will want to supply less. So any of these supply shocks are likely to cause a rise in prices. But as well as supply shocks, we have higher wages. So for example, if a country decided to increase the minimum wage in their economy, then that is an extra cost for businesses. Again, cost of production rise and profits fall, and therefore businesses want to supply less. Could be imported inflation, and this happens most usually if the value of our currency falls. So if the value of the pound, for example, fell, that means that it would cost businesses and individuals in our country, it would cost us more to buy goods from other countries. It would cost us more to import goods, and therefore the price of all those imported goods goes up, and that will cause inflation. And of course, higher taxes will do the same thing. If businesses have to pay higher tax, then that will be reflected in prices. They will put prices up to counter that. So again, let's see how that works on a diagram. Again, we've got our aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves here, and we can see that the initial equilibrium shows that national output is at point Q1 and price level is at point P1. So we get these supply shocks, and the consequence of these supply shocks is that less is going to be supplied at any price. And so the whole supply curve shifts inwards to the left. And we see the result of that is that national output has fallen now from Q1 to Q2, but also the price level has increased from P1 to P2. So that difference between P1 and P2 represents the inflation caused by the supply shocks. So we've seen what causes inflation, but why is it a problem? What are the costs of inflation to an economy or to society as a whole? Well, probably the most problematic cost of inflation is that it breeds uncertainty. And when consumers and when businesses feel uncertain about the future, then they're likely to spend less and invest less. If we have high inflation in our country, then that might make our economy less competitive, and it's a problem for savers. If I've got a lot of money saved and inflation is going up and up and up, that means that the real value of my money is going down and down and down. There are menu costs, cost in repricing everything, cost in changing our website to reflect the new prices, all of those things. And there's a potential fall in real incomes as well. So if I earn £100 per day, if we get high inflation, that £100 per day buys me less and less and less. So the real value of my money is going down. And finally, there are costs of reducing inflation. And this is linked to the point about boom and bust economic cycle, is that governments don't like inflation for all the reasons we've mentioned. And to reduce inflation, the quickest way for a government to do that is to reduce demand. And that has a knock-on effect on the economy and tends to send us into a bit of a decline in that economic cycle. Okay, we're going to finish there. There are a few questions for you to answer now.